I'd just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event, and I need to say that.
Nobody was ready for what Princess and walked into that room to do. What was meant to be a quiet birthday celebration for Princess Charlotte inside Buckingham Palace took an unexpected turn the moment Princess and stepped forward, carrying an old red velvet box. Inside was a royal tiara, one with a history so powerful that its appearance alone changed the atmosphere in the room. But why did Princess and choose Charlotte? And what happened next that left the royal family divided? Join us as we uncover why Princess and honored Charlotte with a royal tiara and the controversy surrounding reports that she demanded Camilla's isolation. The room that was never going to stay quiet. The May sunlight that streamed through the windows of Buckingham Palace's Grand Hall on Charlotte's birthday was the kind of light that makes everything look ceremonial, even when nothing particularly ceremonial is happening. The flowers were arranged correctly. The seating plan had been arranged by someone who understood exactly which family members needed at least 40 feet between them. The catering was excellent. Everything about the room communicated that whoever had prepared this event had considered every possible variable and had a firm grasp of the proceedings. However, they did not have a firm grasp on Princess Anne. She walked in wearing a dark suit, her hair in a high tight bun with the expression of someone who has already decided what to do and is simply waiting for the appropriate moment to do it. She did not make a fuss of her arrival. She found her position at the front of the room, waited until the ambient conversation dropped to something approaching silence, and then began. Charlotte stood beside her in a white dress, her golden hair, her grandmother's eyes, and a child's combination of pride and mild uncertainty about why so many adults were looking at her so intensely. She was 11 years old and had been told this was a birthday celebration, which it technically still was, just not in any way that the word celebration usually implies, and spoke clearly and with the kind of authority that does not require volume. She said she was formally bestowing upon Princess Charlotte a special honorary Diana title, a recognition not of rank or protocol, but of spirit. She said Charlotte was not simply a young member of the House of Windsor. She was the inheritor of the values her grandmother had lived by: compassion, courage, and an absolute refusal to remain comfortable when people were suffering and in need of someone to stand by them. And then she opened the box, revealing the content generated a collective gasp of shock across the room. The tiara inside caught the light from the stained glass windows and cast it in small pieces across the ceiling and the faces of everyone in the room. The applause that followed was scattered and complicated, underscored by a wave of whispered conversation that moved through the crowd like wind through grass. Catherine, Princess of Wales, held William's hand with a grip that was slightly tighter than any photograph would have been able to capture. King Charles sat at the center of the room with an expression that could have meant several different things, and which he appeared to be actively choosing not to clarify. Queen Camilla was on her feet before the applause had fully formed. The chair behind her made a sharp, dry sound against the floor. Her face was a color that had nothing to do with pride or emotion and everything to do with the physical reaction that genuine fury produces in a body when the social filter has been overwhelmed. Her voice was high and cutting music, and entirely uninterested in the decorum that the occasion technically demanded. She said it was completely unacceptable. She said and had no right to make this decision independently. She said the tiara did not belong to anyone in Charlotte's generation. And then she said what everyone in the room was quietly waiting for her to say, because in retrospect, it was always the thing she was going to say. She said Diana was gone, and what the family needed was to look toward the future rather than keep digging up the painful past. The hall went silent in a completely different way than it had been before, and had not moved, had not changed her expression, or even shown any of the signs that someone shows when they have been caught off guard or destabilized by something they did not anticipate. She simply looked at Camilla with the particular steadiness of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment for approximately 6 months, and was watching it arrive precisely as predicted. That look proved that she had been looking forward to Camilla making a fuss and knew exactly how to handle it. There was a very small movement at the corner of her mouth. Almost nobody in the room caught it. It was the smile of someone who has set something in motion and is watching it move. Charlotte looked up at her great-aunt, and with wide eyes, and whispered her question. Had she done something wrong? And bent down to the child's level, and said quietly with complete certainty that her grandmother would have been proud of her right now. No question, without hesitation. Outside the palace gates, the press was already beginning to run. But what nobody in that room yet understood was that the ceremony itself was not the story. The ceremony was the conclusion. The story had been happening for 6 months in suburban cafes, drizzly parking lots, quiet private homes, and a basement in Seriri. And it had all been pointing toward this room, this box, and this music moment. So, what happened during those 6 months that convinced Princess and to make a decision that would stun the royal family? And who was the one person who knew exactly what was coming, but couldn't keep it to himself? The 6 months nobody saw. Princess and had not woken up one morning and decided to hand Diana's tiara to Charlotte on an impulse. What looked from the outside like a bold, spontaneous act of defiance was actually the final move in a very long, very carefully planned sequence of steps. The kind of steps that require meeting people in places you drive to alone, wearing a hat designed to keep your face out of photographs, and listening to things that are difficult to hear without showing on your face that they are difficult to hear. It had started with her noticing small gaps. She had been looking through the royal archives for reasons she had not specified publicly. Perhaps routine family research, or something she had stumbled across that made her curious. What she found in multiple places across multiple time periods were absences where presences had been documented. Files that the records confirmed had existed in 1998, in 2005, and as recently as 2012 are simply gone now. There was no transfer record, no archival note, or even a box labeled "Move to Storage." Just empty slots where things had been. The things that were missing were not administrative documents or bureaucratic records. They were Diana's personal letters to William and Harry from their childhood, photographs from hospital visits and from the landmine walks and from the AIDS wards where Diana had sat with patients in the years when simply entering those rooms was considered an act of political courage. Jewelry worn on charity trips, personal diaries, private photographs, items that taken individually might be explained away as routine archival management. Taken together over multiple years, they formed a pattern that did not have an innocent explanation, and reached out to a former butler named Robert, who had worked directly for Diana for more than a decade. She met him alone at a small quiet house on the outskirts of London on a gray afternoon, wearing a hat and a dark coat, and arriving without any of the apparatus that normally accompanies a member of the royal family when she goes somewhere. Robert was in his late 70s, white-haired, slightly bent, carrying the posture of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and is very tired. He looked around the room carefully before he spoke, even though there was nobody there but the two of them. He said he had debated for a long time before making contact. He said what he was about to tell her could put him in danger. He said he could not take it to his grave. He told her what he had seen. Not a single incident or a single decision, but a series of organized, systematic removals of Diana's personal effects and private documents, beginning after her divorce from Charles in 1996. Palace music has had to announce the separation of the heir to the throne, but both the Prince and Princess of Wales went ahead with their engagements today and accelerating sharply after her death in 1997. 28 years after Princess Diana's sudden and shocking death, Paris, the reports that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident. Those who experienced that tragic day in history firsthand, reflecting on the chaos, confusion, and heartbreak. Items had been gathered and taken away in the middle of the night. Staff members who had been close to Diana, who had witnessed and known things, had been quietly moved to other positions or encouraged to resign with justifications that shifted every time they were examined. Some had received indirect communications that made the consequences of speaking very clear. They were told that their careers, their reputations, and the peace of their families depended on their continued silence. Robert had survived by being careful, but his conscience had outlasted his caution, and by the time he sat across from Anne, he had been carrying the weight of what he knew for nearly 3 decades, and he could not carry it any further, and listened to everything he said without interrupting him. When he finished, she held his hand briefly and told him what he had told her would not be wasted. She drove home that evening with a very different understanding of what she was dealing with. This was not bureaucratic carelessness or natural erosion of archival materials over time. It was deliberate and has been sustained over years. This had a clear purpose to transform Diana from a symbol of compassion and popular connection into simply a sad historical chapter, an unhappy wife, a difficult woman, someone the institution had suffered through and then moved past, someone young people would encounter only in carefully edited summaries that left out everything that made her extraordinary, and was not going to allow that to be the end of the story. She just needed something more than the testimony of an elderly man with a conscience. She needed something a court of opinion could not explain away. But where do you find the kind of evidence that can change a story everyone believes they already know? The basement safe in Surrey. The thing she needed was in Surrey, in a modest house, in a room in the basement, in a safe that had been locked for 20 years. Edward Langford had worked as an archive assistant for the palace until 2008. He had retired to Surrey and had been living quietly ever since, carrying the same thing Robert had been carrying, the knowledge of what he had witnessed and the evidence he had quietly gathered to prove it, waiting for a moment when bringing it forward would produce something other than his own destruction. When and arrived at his house on a stormy evening, he showed her the safe, without any preamble. Inside it were documents wrapped carefully in moisture-proof material, photocopied retrieval records, lists of items removed, dated minutes of internal decisions, specific written instructions for disposal. The kind of documentation that does not simply suggest that something happened, but proves that it was planned, that it was organized, and that it was carried out through an established chain of authority. There was also a small USB drive. Edward explained it before and played it. In 2005, still working in the archives, he had attended a meeting with a small recording device in his jacket pocket. He had become suspicious enough about what he was witnessing to take an action he knew was unauthorized. He had kept the recording for 20 years, alongside the documents waiting, and plugged the drive into her laptop. The recording that came through the speaker was clear. A woman's voice, cold and certain, giving a direct instruction. Dispose of everything. All letters, photographs, and mementos related to Diana. Leave nothing that could remind the public of her. This is an order. This was definitely Camilla's voice from 2005, the year she married King Charles, giving a direct order to erase Diana's presence from the palace records, and sat without moving for a moment that Edward said later felt longer than it probably was. When she finally stood and gathered the documents to leave, she held them against her in the rain all the way to her car. She had spent 6 months building toward this. She had known something like this existed. Holding the actual proof of it in your hands on a stormy evening in Surrey is a different thing from knowing it exists. And she allowed herself to feel the difference before she started the car and drove home. The question now was not whether she had enough. She had more than enough. The question was when and how to use it in a way that could not be quietly dismantled before it reached the people it needed to reach. But before and could make her next move, someone else had already realized the situation was becoming far more serious than expected. So what happens when the person at the center of the story realizes the walls may be closing in? Camilla's response and how it made everything worse. Camilla had not been entirely unaware that something was moving in the shadows of the palace. Her sources were good, and she had been using them. She knew and was asking questions. She knew and was contacting former staff members, but she did not know exactly how much and had or how far back the documentation went. But she understood enough to know that action was required. Her response was swift, thorough, and ultimately beside the point. She ordered a final removal of whatever remaining records existed in the archive system that connected back to Diana or to the disposal operations. The work was done within 48 hours. Clean, complete, no digital footprints, no transfer documentation, nothing in the accessible systems that could be retrieved. She believed she had removed the last of the evidence. She also had calls made to former staff members she suspected and might be approaching. The calls were carefully worded and delivered through intermediaries, but the meaning was not subtle. People who had built quiet retirements and had families they valued were reminded that speaking about things they had witnessed could be costly in specific and practical ways. The calls were designed to produce silence, and for some of the people who received them, they did. She also assembled a contingency plan, a set of internal documents that pointed blame toward a long-departed secretary who had left more than 15 years earlier and had died 2 years ago. If evidence surfaced and could not be denied, Camilla had prepared a version of events in which all of it had been the unauthorized personal decision of someone who could no longer speak for themselves. All of it was thorough, all of it was fast, and all of it was aimed at documents and records that were no longer in the systems she was cleaning, because Edward Langford had made his copies years before any of her operations could reach them and had stored them in a safe in Surrey that nobody in her circle knew existed. She had spent 72 hours executing a counter-operation against evidence that was sitting dry and safe and completely untouched approximately 30 m from the palace, in the basement of a retired archive assistant who had been waiting 20 years for exactly this conversation. But if the evidence had survived untouched, there was only one question left. What would happen when everyone who mattered was finally forced to hear it?